Parshat Noach is tragic from the beginning to the end. God was so excited to create humanity and to have a partner with something on this earth. And then he was so upset with how mankind had evolved and been corrupted that he regretted even creating humans. And it says that, the world became corrupt and that generation was stealing. They were stealing property. They were stealing women. It was just a very selfish society where there was literally only chaos and no order. And then we have this guy named Noah, who it says was righteous in his generation. Um, and the big question is, and that Noah walked with God. And the big question is, if Noah was so righteous, why did it have to say in his generation? Why couldn't it have just said he was a righteous person and leave it at that? And even more so, there have been so many great leaders in our Torah. We have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and Joseph and Moses. Nobody gets a parsha named after them. Nobody gets this type of opening sentence that they were so righteous. So, what is it that stood out so much about Noah that made him get this amazing title? And at the same time, why did it limit him to just his generation? And what's the real tragedy that went on here? So, really quickly, because again, there's so much packed into this parsha and into the Noach story. What made Noach so special is that he had chen, which in Hebrew, the Hebrew is chen, the English word is grace, right? And I think about like somebody who's graceful. They're very pleasant, good energy, they're nice. But somebody who's graceful is kind of a little bit shy, quiet, a little bit to themselves. They're not, going out to change the world. That was Noach. Interesting, the word chen, which means grace, and Noach are the same letters, just reversed. And I think that's who Noach was. To be around so many corrupt people, to be around such a corrupt society, Noach was like this pleasant person, like he kind of came out of nowhere. Imagine if you have a classroom of like disruptive students, and then there's one like nice kid in the back, just keeps to themselves, always smiling, just good, doesn't do anything. That was Noah, which is great, right? It's such a nice attribute and characteristic to have. The problem is that's kind of like step one. Like to be a good-hearted person, to be righteous, to be graceful is something that is a trait that we value and we admire, but it's not the like highest level. And imagine all that time that Noah was building this ark when God said, "Hey, I'm going to destroy the world, but I'm saving you and your family. Go build this massive ark that you can have all of the animals of the world and all these different species, and I'm going to save you." It probably took him a really long time to build that ark. And imagine during all that time, people could have asked him, "Hey, Noah, what are you doing?" And he didn't once say, building an ark, God's about to destroy all of you. I think you should go repent. I think you should change. He didn't even warn the people. And not just that, he didn't even fight with God. He didn't even say, like, hey, God, like maybe you should reconsider destroying humanity. Like, I know I'm lovely, but these people have potential to change. And I think that, anyone has the ability to change in a good way or a bad way. And I really believe that these people can do better. They can do tshuva, which in Judaism is like the highest level. To do tshuva is like to repent. It's why we're here, because everyone makes mistakes. It's how do you handle your mistakes? How do you handle your regret? How do you handle obstacles that are in front of you? But he didn't do that. And that was the downfall of Noah. That yes, he had this great potential, but he never lived up to it. And it's funny because the person who changes at the end of the story is Noah. He plants a vineyard, he gets super drunk. There's a terrible incident with one of his sons, which I'm not going to go into, but he almost died in a sense, a failure for himself, right? He couldn't live with himself. And I think this like graceful, righteous person he started out to be isn't how he is remembered at the end. And maybe that's because he didn't believe in the positive change, and therefore he didn't realize that he could have a negative change on him. But what I want to focus on is in his generation, because this is a very common um, this is a very common question, and Rashi actually has a really interesting answer, and it's that Noah was righteous for his generation, but had he been in the generation of Abraham, he wouldn't have been considered as righteous. Some people say he would have been even more righteous. Like, imagine he was so righteous for his wicked generation, and imagine if he would have been in a generation of greats. And it's this big question, like, which is the right one? Is it that he could have been even greater, or that he was actually very small compared to the greats? And I once heard something by Rabbi Ari Khan, who's my rabbi, which I found was fascinating. That there was, as much as we view these characters as very different timelines, they did overlap. And they overlapped at the Tower of Babel. So, yes, Noah was righteous for his generation. He wasn't this wicked person, but he was in the generation of Abraham. And I think when we look at the Tower of Babel story, we realize the downfall of humanity and why things carried out the way that they did. So the story goes, of course, God sends a flood. Noah's family is in the ark. They're in the ark for 40 days. It takes a while for the water to subside. Eventually, they leave the ark, and Noah and his family repopulate the planet. And as time goes on, the humanity becomes of one people, one language, and they say, let us build. They learn how to create bricks and how to create mortar, and they say, let us build a tower that can basically reach the heavens. And as they're building it, God comes down and basically scatters everybody across the earth and makes them all have a different language, and they're unable to complete this task. It's a very bizarre story. And of course, next week's Parsha is beginning with Lech Lecha, when we have the real Abraham story beginning, which is really where the Jewish people's story begins. And I find it fascinating because what were these people trying to do, right? Like, why are they trying to build a tower? Why are they trying to reach God? Why are they trying to reach the heavens? And for me, the only thing that really logically makes sense, even though there's a million different reasons you can give to why the people want to build this tower, is they grew up hearing about this flood. They all know that they're descendants of the sole survivors of this flood that destroyed the world. When they finally hit this point where they can create, imagine, like, what if God tries to make a flood again? We have to be prepared. We have to be able to have something that is tall enough, that can literally reach the heavens, that won't be able to destroy us. I mean, just logically makes sense, right? Like, if they get into this, they build this huge tower and God sends a flood, they're going to be at the top. They're going to be just fine. The people of that generation weren't perfect, right? There was still something not right about them. And I believe that sometimes it's easier to buy change than it is, or to have change on the outside versus having real change on the inside. The goal of the Torah, the goal of humanity, the goal of everything we're learning is, how can you be the best person? How can you have the best morals and values? And we're all going to make mistakes. It's very clear that even if you're created by God, you got God in the garden, or you're set up by God, the number one matchmaker on the planet, you're still going to mess up. You're still going to make errors. Even if you're righteous for your generation, you're still going to make mistakes. And our job isn't to be perfect. It's to deal with things in the most perfect way, which means having real tshuva and wanting to really change from the inside. That generation didn't want to change. They didn't want to do the hard, introspective, emotional change. They just want to do the physical change. They want to protect themselves for the future, but not in a way where I think society was heading in the right direction. And I think God realizes, hey, I can't change humanity. I cannot get all these people to get on board to do the right thing. But there is one person out there who has everything that I need in a leader, everything that I want to change the way humanity is going to look. And that's Abraham. He's the person that when God says he wants to destroy Sodom and, kill all the people, he fights with God. He's like, no, what if there's 50 righteous people or 40 righteous people or 30 righteous people? He fights for humanity. Their people can be righteous, people can change. He's the person that runs after anyone who's walking by his tent because he wants to greet them. It's where we learn hospitality from. It's he runs out and looks out for everybody else. He's the most selfless individual. There's not a selfish bone in him. And that's the greatness of Abraham. And that's where God's like, you know what? We're going to take a cue from Abraham and we're going to start this people and work with this specific person. So I'm going to mix up all of humanity and I'm going to focus on this one guy because Abraham was at the Tower of Babel. He was there. And that's where God said, we're going in a different direction. And I think the real lessons about leadership, and yes, Noah was righteous and Noah was graceful and he was a special, good, kind person, but he wasn't a leader. And I don't even believe he was a leader to himself because when the flood ended, it took him a long time to leave that ark. He wasn't able to lead himself out. He needed God to constantly tell him what to do. And the second God didn't say leave the ark, he just stayed in. He just listened to the rules. He just followed everything. But if we were supposed to be a bunch of slaves, we wouldn't have free will. And we're supposed to not only be a leader for society or for our family, but ultimately each person has to be a leader to themselves. And that was the major difference between Abraham and Noah. And we learn about leadership skills, and I really believe the essence of Judaism from Abraham. And I know that this is another, I'll leave with this. There's another major question is why do we start the Torah with these stories? Why don't we start with all the commandments and the mitzvot and the things that, are the laws that we live by? And it's because those laws are meaningless if you're, in my opinion, you're not a good person. And I think that on one level, we learn from Noah how to just be good, but in a very simple way. But really, it's being a good person is constantly trying to improve yourself, looking yourself in the mirror and saying, yesterday this happened, but today I'm going to move forward. I always have a second chance. I always have a chance to improve and to work on myself and to also help others because you can't only focus on self improvement and shut out the rest of the world. So much of healing is about constantly giving to others and then also knowing how to give to yourself and this balance. And that's what we learned from Abraham. And that's the moral integrity you have to have in order to take on all the commandments. Otherwise, the commandments are literally worthless and they get taken in the wrong direction, in my opinion, because the commandments and the laws are secondary to being a good person and a leader for not just yourself and your generation, but for all of humanity. Shabbat Shalom.